Hey, welcome back everyone. Mr. Randolph here. In this video, I want to go over prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Two different classifications that we can put cells into. And believe it or not, we can organize living things into these two classifications as well, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So in this video, we'll talk about some similarities between the two cell types and really what sets the two cell types apart. I have a couple of images here, and we'll see these throughout the video. This is a prokaryotic organism. This is an illustration. It's a very typical one that you'll see in a lot of textbooks and online, and anything that talks about prokaryotes, you'll see something similar to this. This is actually an electron microscope view of a specific bacterium, so we can see what it looks like in real life. And then over here we have a standard illustration of an animal eukaryotic cell. So again, this is one that you'll see quite frequently or something similar to it. Not all cells look this way. It's just a way that we can illustrate all the parts within the cells. So let's dive in and see what these two cells are like. So again, the two basic cell types are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. I have some pictures there of the two. If you notice, they look very different just in the way that the pictures are. This is taken with an electron microscope, which is why it looks the way that it does. This was actually taken with a light microscope. So we'll talk about why that is, but when we see the images of them, the real images of the two cell types, they do look different because we have to use different microscopes to see them. There are four things that all cells have in common. It doesn't matter if it's prokaryotic or eukaryotic, they will have these four things. All cells have a cell membrane, which is really just kind of the skin of the cell. It's what sets the cell apart from everything around it. It surrounds it. It's on the outside of the cell, controls what goes in and out. And that cell membrane is going to be a part of every living cell. All cells have DNA. DNA, if you remember from learning this, is the molecule that holds the instructions to make all the proteins that a cell needs. Proteins are those molecules that do specific jobs for cells. Cells can't stay alive without those proteins, and so it makes sense that all cells are going to have that genetic material or the instructions to make those proteins inside them. So all cells have DNA. And then ribosomes. Ribosomes are a structure inside of cells that make proteins. So again, if a cell needs a protein to stay alive, it just makes sense that it's going to have the ribosomes inside of it to help make those proteins. And cytoplasm is that jelly-like substance, that fluid that's inside the cells, fills the cell up and kind of holds everything in place where it needs to be. So these four things you'll find in all living cells. I've got some videos that go into each one of those and their roles in a little more detail, but just know that these are going to be in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So let's talk about what sets them apart. What makes them different from each other? Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus inside them. Not only that, they don't have any of the membrane-bound structures inside them that do specific jobs. A lot of those things that you have learned about throughout your schooling inside the animal cells and plant cells. Prokaryotes don't have those. All they have inside them is this region where the DNA is kept. It's called the nucleoid region, and there's nothing surrounding the DNA to keep it there. It's stored in that general vicinity inside the cell, filled with cytoplasm, and then you can see these little dots that represent the ribosomes all spread throughout the cell there. They have a cell membrane around them. A lot of times they have a cell wall. Cell wall is a rigid structure that protects the cell, and a lot of times they'll have some kind of protein extensions on the outside, these cilia or flagella that help the cell move through its surrounding environment. But they're really, really simple. There's not much to them. We believe that the first life forms on the planet were prokaryotic life forms. And it kind of makes sense that they would be very, very simple, not complex at all, because they were just developing the molecules to be able to survive. And so they're very small, and one of the easiest Venn diagrams that you could make is that all prokaryotic cells are a type of bacteria, and all bacteria are prokaryotic. So that's one easy way to tell them apart. They're also all single-celled organisms because they are really simple. They can't specialize, they can't carry out certain functions, so they are all single-celled organisms. Here's a couple of images of them. We have some E. coli, some cyanobacteria, the different bacterial types. And if you look at this, these are all pictures taken by an electron microscope. Again, they're so small, we can't get this detailed of an image of bacteria or prokaryotic organisms without having that very high-powered electron microscope. They're just too small to be able to magnify that much with a light microscope. We can't see it that well. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are much larger, and they're much larger because they have all of these things inside them, all of these different structures, and these are what we call organelles. They have a membrane around them. They have their own membrane separate from the cell membrane. Eukaryotic cells have what we call a true nucleus. It's a membrane-bound structure in the middle of the cell where the DNA is kept. And they have all of these specialized parts inside the cell that do a very specific job. In other videos, I'll go into detail about what each one of those organelles does and why they're important for the cell. But if you think about it, if a cell has this many things inside of it, it's going to be a lot larger than a prokaryotic cell. And so this is kind of a poor picture to do it this with, but if you wanted a comparison, a eukaryotic cell versus a prokaryotic cell, prokaryotic cells are typically about the size of a mitochondria. And so they're much, much, much smaller than the eukaryotic cells. Some eukaryotic cells can have hundreds of mitochondria inside them, just depending on how much they need, how much energy they need. So that's the biggest difference. Eukaryotic cells have organelles inside them. Prokaryotic cells do not. When I was in school, I had a little rhyme that I used to remember that. Pro has no organelles, and you do have organelles. I know it's cheesy, but it can help. Because they have those organelles, eukaryotic cells are much bigger. And because those organelles carry out specific jobs, eukaryotic cells can become very specialized. And so let's take a look at that. Some eukaryotic organisms are single-celled. So they're made up of one cell, amoebas, parameciums, a lot of protists, and some fungi are single-celled organisms. But the majority of eukaryotic organisms are multicellular. Because those cells have those specific organelles inside them that can carry out certain jobs, the cells can become very specialized. And so that is an advantage for the organism because they can have specialized tissues. Those tissues allow the organisms to move around, respond a little bit more to their environment, and allows the organisms to adapt to and survive in different environments. And so they can survive in places where other organisms may not. Taking a look at that on a human level, we have a lot of different cell types inside of our body. We have nerve cells, blood cells, all of these specific cell types that carry out different jobs, and those cell types make up different tissues. Those tissues do certain things, and all of that works together to keep us alive and allow us to function in the way that we do. And so the cell types that make these up have different shapes. You can see here where the muscle cell is going to be a little bit different than, say, a skin cell or a blood cell because it carries out a different job. And it allows us to have specialized organs. So here's just some more examples. We can see the skin cells have a very different shape than, say, a muscle cell. So muscle cells are going to be long because they contract and relax, where skin cells are kind of flat and rounded because they're on the outside of our body and serve almost like an armor. Plant cells have specialized cells as well, or plants, have specialized cells. This is just an example of xylem and phloem. Those are transport tissues within plants. And each one of those tissues carries out a different job, and so the cell types there are a little bit different from each other. And so that specialization really just gives eukaryotic organisms the ability to adapt and carry out different jobs. So hopefully that clears up some of the differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. I will have some other videos down the line that go into detail about the different structures and organelles inside eukaryotic cells so you can see what roles they carry out.